My real name, Edmund Lindsay Basher, actually, but I go by Ned Basher. January 27th, 1944, in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. 1982, in September of 1982, I bought the Rossport Inn. Yes, my father is from Pennsylvania, and his grandparents were from Pennsylvania, and my mother was from Virginia, and her grandparents are from Virginia. My grandparents as well. The first time, 1963. The second time, 1971. The third time, 1986. My present wife, Sheila. We met on a beach in the Bahamas in March of 1986. We just had one child. His name is Brett, and he's 24 years old, and he lives in Sydney, Australia. I went to university, finished university in 1965. I went to Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, Maryland, and in 1966 I joined the U.S. Air Force. And I flew jet fighters from 1966 until 1978. And I kind of bummed around a little bit, and in 1982 I bought the Rossport Inn. I did actually. When I was, I flew with in the regular Air Force first, and then when I got out of the regular Air Force in 1970, I flew with the Minnesota Air National Guard out of Duluth, and I volunteered at a children's home actually in Duluth, Minnesota. Favorite memories of Rossport, let's see. Actually, I first came to Rossport in 1971 on a sailing vessel. We were on our way to a Trans-Superior sailboat race, which raced from Sault Ste. Marie back to Duluth, and I was living in Duluth at the time. And we came up to Rossport by sailboat from Duluth and went through Thunder Bay and Porphyry Island and Armour Harbor, Woodbine Harbor, and then into Rossport. Now, when you come the first time to Rossport by boat, and you round the point here in Rossport and come into the harbor, it doesn't strike you immediately that there's any other access than by water or by train, because you've heard the train, and you're not immediately, you can't immediately see the Trans-Canada or any cars. So I remember in early August of 1971, rounding the point into Rossport, thinking, who lives in this little town? It kind of was like a Newfoundland outport, you know, with the only access by water. And as you get a bit closer, you do start to see that there are some cars and roads, then you can eventually hear and see the Trans-Canada. And we went up to the old Tedesco store and got gas for our boat, and also bought a few fishing lures and an ice cream cone up there. And that, I'd say, probably is one of my favorite memories, because that was the first time I came in Rossport. And I remembered it as being such a unique little community situated on the water, kind of with its back turned to the hills behind us here. And interestingly enough, I'm sure that the population, I know that since I came here in 1982, and probably since 1971, there are fewer people living in Rossport today in 2014 than there were either in 1971 or 1982. And another one of my favorite memories is in 1982, when my older brother and I, who happens to be here right now, came on another sailboat I had, and we sailed up in here into Rossport. And I told him, when we get to Rossport, we'll be able to eat at the Rossport Inn, because we had eaten here actually in 1971 when I came on that sailboat that time. But when we came here in 1982, the place was all closed up and for sale. And we came up and looked at it, and after my brother went back to New York, in fact, at that time Navia ran, I took him into Schreiber to the train station. I sat down at the dock for a week or 10 days on my little sailboat, looking up at the old Rossport Inn, wondering if I should do it or not. And I decided I'd do it, and I bought it from the Federal Business Development Bank in September of 1982. I actually had a terrible temper as a child, and I smashed a lot of things. And sometimes I'd smash things I liked, and I'd have to put them back together. So I like putting things back together. I got really good at putting things back together. But as a child, let me see, I collected stamps, actually. I was a stamp collector. And I collected butterflies. My younger brother and I would catch snakes and sell them we went to a boarding school in Philadelphia, and we would catch snakes, garter snakes and other small snakes, and we would take them on the bus down to Philadelphia and sell them to the city kids who'd never seen a snake. Of course, being an American, I have a slightly different viewpoint than Canadians. Of course, in the time period in my lifetime, of course, universal health care started here in Canada with Tommy Douglas in the 60s, but of course in the States they're still not quite there all these many years later. But I mean, technology is the obvious answer. Cell phones, computers, and all this stuff now they have with technology wasn't even dreamed of. Back when I was, in the 50s when I started school and stuff. So yeah, that's the obvious answer. And of course, for me, I sort of lived through the era of the Cold War, and the communists are around every corner. At least I thought that in the United States, and all these years later, of course, now we're relatively friendly with the communists, with the Russians, and whatever. And so I think actually, the political changes and the technology changes would have to be right at the top. I still collect stamps. I don't collect butterflies anymore, but I still collect stamps. And sailing, we have a beautiful sailboat that we keep here now, and the Rossport Inn has sort of become a hobby. Now we used to have a much more elaborate operation here with licensed dining and everything, and the rooms upstairs. But now we just rent the cabins, and it's one thing I do now I actually like to build model airplanes. I've got a few in the other room that I'll take and show you later. That some of the ones that I flew actually, some that I would have liked to have flown. It's sort of nostalgic to put together models of different jet fighters. I flew the F-102 and the F-100, and the F-4. I would say of course the overriding story in Rossport and the Rossport Inn, because it seems like the owner of the Rossport Inn kind of inherits the story. It's the story of the Gunilda, the private yacht that sunk in Rossport, off about 4 miles east of Rossport in 1911. It was owned by a very wealthy American, and he was coming from Port Caldwell, about 30 or 40 miles to the east of us here, after taking a load of coal, and he hit McGarvey Shoal, like I say, just inside Copper Island, about 4 miles from here. And the boat was stuck on the shoal. I have various different pictures here in the lobby of the boat stuck on the shoal, and some pictures of it underwater. And actually, the top section of the foremast is just right outside the door here. But the family that owned it came when the boat was stuck on the rocks. They got their launch and came to Rossport and stayed here in the Rossport Inn, and used the telegraph from the old Rossport train station, which is no longer there, but and telegraphed to Thunder Bay to get the tug Wayland to come tow it off. And when the Wayland did attempt to tow it off, it sunk and went to the bottom of Lake Superior, and it's about 300 feet deep. And a number of divers come. In fact, there was a diving group this summer staying with us who were out diving on it. And I did meet, there have been 2 fatalities, one in 1970 and one in 1989. And we were actually here, and I met the fellow who died diving on it in 1989. And I think that, like I say, it seems like the owner of the Rossport Inn kind of inherits the Gunilda story, because it was so tied to it. In fact, the famous picture taken of it stuck on the shoal right there was taken by Oscar Anderson, who was the owner of the Rossport Inn at the time in 1911. It was built by the railroad in 1884. In fact, I've got some pictures of it that show the inn. In fact, the area we're sitting in right now was once a front porch, and the actual building started about 10 feet away from what is now the front door. The front door would have been 10 feet away from where it is now. And there is no road. There's no Bowman Street that comes down the street here. You can just see the Rossport Inn and a trail leading to the tracks, and then on down to the waterfront. So this was built, like I say, by the railroad in the 1880s, and there were no cars. There was no need to have Bowman Street here. So it was then sold to a family named the Healy's. Owned it for a while, and I think when the railroad built it and the Healy's owned it, it was called the Oriental Hotel. It wasn't called the Rossport Inn, because the name Rossport is actually relatively recent, in that it was named for John Ross, who was the local construction engineer for the railroad in this area. And prior to that, it was called McKay's Harbor. So in 1884, it would have been called McKay's Harbor instead of Rossport. The Healy family owned it. Was called the Oriental Hotel, and then they sold it in 1910 to Oscar Anderson. The Anderson family bought it in 1910, and somewhere I think my wife has a bill of sale. They sold it. They purchased it for $1,200 in 1910, and then the Anderson family, their daughter, they had one daughter, Esther Anderson. She married Toy Seppala, and Toy Seppala married, like I say, married Esther. They had one daughter, Lorraine Seppala, who actually still owns a little house next door. But anyway, they owned it as a family, the Andersons and the Seppalas, from 1910 till 1973. In 1973, it was sold to a partnership of 13 guys from Thunder Bay. The head guy with the idea was Andre Nickel, and there were different Thunder Bay people: John Fancy, Dave Oja, John Crooks, David Phipps, different ones who were involved with it. And they bought it from the Seppala family for $50,000 in 1973. Now, they didn't actually pay the 50. Each partner put up $500, and for $500 you got a 1/13 share of the Rossport Inn. And now, they didn't have any real experience within the business like this, and they actually hired managers to run it for them, and it started to go downhill like a freight train almost immediately. And it eventually went through different owners, and by 1978, none of the original owners were even part of it anymore, and it was owned by a guy named Mirasanovskis, and he filed bankruptcy in the early fall of 1978, and it sat vacant until I bought it in September 1982. In fact, when I bought it from the Federal Business Development Bank, after I closed the deal, I actually paid $23,000 for it, but it wasn't worth that, to tell you the truth, because it was in such terrible condition. The guy at the Federal Business Development Bank told me that if I hadn't bought it, they were going to tear it down the next month, because they thought the land would be worth more with the building off it, and they were right, actually. My friends told me I was crazy to buy this old place at the end of a dead-end street in a town of 65 or 70 people. And I am actually crazy. Scott McWilliams can verify for that. But it's been a real labor of love fixing the old place up, and thousands of people have enjoyed it over the years, and and like I say, we still continue to operate it in a somewhat less of a fashion, but it's a great place. I have always been a seasonal resident in Rossport from the day I bought the place, and so I'd have to admit that I am not really totally integrated into the community, because I do just come here seasonally. I leave, I'm here for roughly 6 months, and I'm gone for 6 months. But I love it for the time period I'm here. I mean, winter has never been my favorite season. My favorite sports are swimming and tennis, which are hard to do in the wintertime. So I never, from the time I saw it, I just thought I'll be here in the summer. It'll just be a summer place. And the place is magical in the summer. It is absolutely magical. Like I say, we were just out on our sailboat, spent the night last night over the Powder Islands, and we never saw another boat, we never saw another person until we came into the Rossport Harbor. And it's pretty magical to be in a place where literally it hasn't changed since I first saw it in 1971. I mean, there are a few different houses, things, but I know there are fewer people here, and there aren't many places in the world where you can come back all those many years later and it hasn't changed. And Rossport's one of those places, and I think that's real magic to it.